United States invasion of Iraq began on March 19, 2003. The invasion was a culmination of long-standing tensions between the two countries created by geopolitical events of the preceding decade. On August 2, 1990, the Iraqi President Saddam Hussein sent 140,000 troops into Kuwait, accompanied by an additional 18,000 tanks. Within a year, a U.S.-led coalition had been sent in and defeated the Iraqi army.
At every opportunity, I have said to the people of Iraq that our quarrel was not with them, but instead with their leadership, and above all with Saddam Hussein.
Indeed, the U.S. quarrel continued with Hussein, who maintained power and persisted in his persecution of the Kurdish minority and Shia Muslims. Following the war, the UN implemented economic sanctions against Iraq and in the mid-1990s sent in inspectors. These inspectors uncovered a range of prohibited weapons. The Iraqis continued to defy UN weapons restrictions, and in 1998, Bill Clinton ordered the bombing of several military installations in Iraq. Then, on September 11, 2001, disaster struck the United States when 19 Islamic extremists that were a part of the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 planes and proceeded to carry out suicide attacks that claimed the lives of nearly 3,000 people. The attacks were ordered by Osama bin Laden, but President Bush implied to the world that Saddam Hussein had been involved, despite having no evidence that this was the case.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
Just over a year after this State of the Union address, on February 5, 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell delivered an intentionally misleading speech to the United Nations that was riddled with fabrications.
Since Saddam Hussein forced out the last inspectors in 1998, we have amassed much intelligence indicating that Iraq is continuing to make these weapons. Our conservative estimate is that Iraq today has a stockpile of between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agent.
All of these claims made by Powell regarding weapons of mass destruction were later proved false. Nevertheless, the assertions made by Powell justified the later invasion in the public's eyes, even though the United Nations itself was unmoved, and France and Germany strongly opposed the impending war. On March 17, 2003, the U.S. was on the brink of war as President Bush delivered an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein on national television.
All the decades of deceit and cruelty have now reached an end. Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
When Hussein didn't respond, Bush gave the order to launch missiles at Iraq at 7:12 p.m. on March 19, 2003. This preliminary strike targeted Hussein and his 2 sons after intelligence reports indicated he was in a bunker in southern Baghdad. President Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office later that night.
Fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The New York Times reported the following morning that the missiles had missed Hussein, but that subsequent bombs dropped in the early hours of March 20th had successfully hit government and military installations. The ensuing military campaign was brief. U.S.-led forces invaded Iraq from Kuwait and Jordan within days. They met little resistance as Marines and Army troops advanced up the Tigris-Euphrates River towards the capital. Many Iraqi troops even surrendered when confronted by U.S. troops, and their greatest opposition in southern Iraq was from Ba'ath Party supporters that had formed paramilitary organizations. U.S. forces faced the largest issue in the north, where the Turkish government had denied them access to air bases and had refused to allow army units to pass through the nation. This was seen as a huge insult from a NATO ally and caused the $30 billion in proposed aid to the country to be revoked. Despite this setback, U.S. paratroopers were able to land in the north, where they were joined by Kurdish Peshmerga fighters. When U.S. troops reached Baghdad, they were confronted with heavily armed paramilitary units that were part of the Ba'ath Party's Republican Guard. The resistance in Baghdad collapsed on April 9th, and the U.S. soldiers took control of the city. Meanwhile, British forces had been deployed to the southern city of Basra and were also able to overcome resistance and take the city on the same day as Baghdad fell to the U.S. Following 2 days were met with 2 more victories as the paratroopers and Peshmerga fighters captured the northern cities of Kirkuk and Mosul on April 10th and 11th.
My fellow Americans, major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
On May 1, 2003, President Bush declared victory while on board the USS Abraham Lincoln as a mission accomplished banner flew above his head. The aftermath, however, that would absorb U.S. resources and draw public and political criticism. On December 13, 2003, Saddam Hussein was captured and turned over to Iraqi authorities. Then, in June of 2004, he stood trial, was convicted of crimes against humanity, and on December 30, 2006, was executed. While many in the U.S. saw this as a victory, in May of 2004, pictures had emerged that showed the abuse of Iraqi prisoners by American troops and had soured the public opinion against the war.
I feel terrible about what happened to these Iraqi detainees.
I'd do it again in a minute.
As support in the U.S. waned, the events in Iraq had began to disintegrate. In 2005, Americans had held a series of elections to fill the political vacuum left by Hussein and the defeat of the Ba'ath Party. The result was the installation of a Shia government. Since the early 20th century, the minority Sunni Muslims had held onto power after being installed as proxy rulers by the British. While Sunnis make up 90% of the world's Muslim population, they compose a mere 30% of Iraqi Muslims. Even after the election of the majority Shia government, Sunni and Shia militias took power over different areas of Iraq. The effect was a sectarian cleansing that created a mass exodus of over 2 million refugees. In response, the U.S. increased the number of troops, which did help decrease the violence, but tensions remained high. In 2007, the U.S. began the withdrawal of troops, and in 2011, Obama announced that the war was officially over.
So, today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. After nearly 9 years, America's war in Iraq will be over.
Do you feel that this huge sacrifice that you've made has been for a cause that has been worthwhile?
I can't answer that question right now.
Since the start of the conflict, an estimated 179,000 civilians and an additional 42,591 military personnel have lost their lives.